Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, zerilli-marimò. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for a very special Conversazione that Antonio Monda is having with Judith Thurman. And this is, is part of a mini-series within the series, that is the Conversazioni, about forgotten or not well appreciated enough films. And even before the evening, like now, I don't know the films that they're going to discuss. I'd like to have the surprises you will have. But I assure you that before you go home, the titles, the directors, and all the information you might need, if you want to look for them and see them, are going to be on our website. It's exactly the same page where the invitation was. Julian is adding right now and unveiling the mystery of what the 6 films are. And for me, the previous installations of this series were very eye-opening and allowed me to see films that I would have never seen, and also to see again films that deserve a second look. And tonight we have Judith Thurman with us that is going to discuss with Antonio her 3 films, and Antonio in turn is going to propose his 3. As you know, in the format of these Conversazioni, we don't do long and lengthy presentations. You find the complete biographies and bibliographies of both Judith and Antonio on the website of the Casa. I just want to mention their latest books, their newest books. For Judith is The Left-Handed Woman, and for Antonio there is the upcoming Il Numero è Nulla, that is the 9th of the 10 installments dedicated to decades in New York history. And that's coming up in Italy on March 7th. And tonight we also have the pleasure of having with us several protagonists of the Conversazioni in Capri. And I'm going to name the names that I think I remember. If somebody is missing Antonio with his gaze, he's going to find you and mention you probably at some point. So we have with us tonight, and I ask you for an applause at the end, Ian Buruma, Mary Karr, Stuart Klawans, Marina Sagona, Nicole Krauss, Lila Azam Zanganeh, and Kolo Mekan. I believe these are the ones that I have identified. Have you been to Capri to the Conversazione and I have not mentioned your name? Great. I think Antonio did a great job. And now please welcome Antonio Monda and Judith Thurman.
Buonasera a tutti. Good evening. Let's switch immediately to English. So you know the format, 3 films Judith, 3 films myself. I want to thank you all, in particular all our guests in Capri. This is what the conversation is about. I'm very proud and honored to have you here. Let's start. We have a very rich program, and I'm happy to say that 2 of the 6 films are Italian films, and I didn't push at all. So let's see Judith's first choice. Okay, Judith, why did you pick this film? And then we'll discuss.
Each of the films that I chose was in some ways based on a deeply personal relationship to the film or the subject. And I think it's Agnès Varda's greatest film. And I had met her in the 70s when One Sings and the Other Doesn't had its premiere in New York, and we became friends. I remember taking her around New York in an old car that I had with Isabelle Huppert to see the Judy Chicago installation at the Brooklyn Museum. This would have been 77, 76. And then this film is dedicated to Nathalie Sarraute. And Agnès introduced me to her in Paris. And the 2 of them were these great older women artists who moved me tremendously, and their work inspired me tremendously. And so I took Agnès' greatest film as one of my 3 forgotten gems. It's not forgotten, but it's a long time. It hasn't. It's after her death. Of course, there was a sort of revival of Varda, but it's memorable also because it's the portrait of a woman a girl really, and Sandrine Bonnaire, the actress, was 18 when she played the role. Who she says no. She says no to everything, and the courage to refuse and the price that she pays for it just has always struck me as a profoundly admonitory and moving lesson.
The film won the Golden Lion in Venice, And I totally agree. Not only is Varda's best film, together with Cleo maybe, but also Bonner's best performance. However, I don't know what to do with her character. I don't know if I like her, dislike her. Maybe we're not supposed to like or dislike her. What do you think?
Well, I think one of the points the film makes is that the obligation of women to be pleasing, and the obligation of women to make themselves lovable, and especially to be grateful. And this is a completely ungrateful female character. So she's supposed to she gets on everyone's nerves, and she's supposed to get on our nerves, and we're supposed to examine that reaction. The male vagabond is usually a man escaping some shameful secret or guilt or whatever, and we don't know exactly what she's escaping. But that's it's a freedom, it's sort of an Elena Ferrante-like freedom from goodness, from the firelight and the...
Even if this search for freedom brings her to desperation and death at the end.
I don't know, desperation because it's cold and she has no money and all kinds of terrible things befall her. But, and of course she does, it's not a spoiler, the movie opens with her body being found. Yes, because there's a terrible price for women who transgress the roles that have been established for them.
Do you agree to consider Agnès Varda not only a pioneer of Nouvelle Vague, but also a pioneer of feminist cinema?
Yes, absolutely. She had a good marriage and a child and a beautiful house and all kinds of other things, and she was very domestic. But she was ferocious, and her strength of character, her ferocity as a person, her bulldog-like ferocity as a character was very pioneering, and she was in some ways, for a time at least, until later on in her life, a bit in the shadow of her husband, Jacques Demy.
Jacques Demy.
Yeah.
And do you like also the films that he made to celebrate Demy, her husband?
Less.
I agree. They're the least interesting, honestly. And don't get me wrong, Demy was a very good filmmaker.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And she adored him. But
she did adore him.
But
yes.
you can feel also the ferocious aspect, even in those films.
You can, yes.
Yeah.
No, you definitely can.
Let's go now to my first choice. It's an American film. And let's watch it, then I'll say. So Arthur Penn, I think, is one of the unsung heroes of American cinema. It's completely forgotten now. And this is one of his best films, but it was completely overlooked, although Vincent Cambio in the New York Times wrote a rave review. The scene is very moving to me because Agnès told the same idea several times in many articles, in many books. And it's about the friendship of four friends and a woman. They're all in love with the same woman. One of the friends told this guy, Craig Wasson is the name of the actor, even in 10, 15, 20 years, when the man will land on the moon, we have to think each other. We have to say to each other, we made it. But the fact is the other guy died. And now he's alone, watching on television, finally the man on the moon. And somehow he tried to keep his promises. But he's alone with a new friend who has two adopted Asian girls who cannot understand what's going on. And I think this is extremely moving because he's faithful and he honors his promise, but he's alone, completely alone. I don't know if you like Arthur Penn work.
No, I do. I like it. I have never seen this, and I'm sort of. I also I'm waiting to be surprised by your choices. It's really moving. Just that.
I'm happy that you feel the same.
Yeah.
Of course, Arthur Penn, you might remember Bonnie and Clyde, The Chase, Night Moves, Little Big Man. But somehow in the 80s, he never had a hit. And this was his last film, which was at least critically acclaimed. I strongly recommend, especially my students, to watch it. Mass. Let's go now to Judith's second choice. I love this film, but I want to hear from you.
Well, this is the Yakuza, Sidney Pollack's The Yakuza, and I knew Sidney very well. He bought my biography of Isaac Dinesen, which he turned into Out of Africa, and he hired me or invited me to work on it. And I was in Africa for 5 months, so without a real job, but I was outside the caste system of the crew, so I had a sort of strange time there. And I realized after a while my job was to ride back into Nairobi every day with Sydney and listen to him complain about everything, including the movie business and his own incapacity. And
it's an important job, that.
yes, and it was a very important job. And we would have dinner once a week and talk about life and film and everything like that. And he told me that he said, you know, Out of Africa is going to be a flop. You can't make a great movie out of a work of literature. Out of an A story can only make a B film. So he was sort of in despair about the film. And he said, but if you want to see a good film that I made, it's the Yakuza. That's a good film. And he was really, really proud of it. And he always was proud of it. And the Yakuza was a big flop. In fact, a critical flop. It was very expensive and it wasn't understood when it came
What did you like? What do you like about the Yakuza?
Well, all these the films that what I like about it is it's the beauty of the direction, the extraordinary finesse of the acting, the choreography. I was wondering how Antonio was going to pick a clip because this has some of the greatest fight scenes in cinema history. Just extraordinary, of great violence, very staggering violence.
It's an interesting way how Pollack stage the violence, because it's very violent and very well choreographed, but it happens all of a sudden. The film has a very slow pace, and then all of a sudden there are a couple of explosions of violence. I think this is a film about clash of culture, Americans versus Japanese, but also there is a sense of respect for old codes, even criminal codes. Somehow he respects those codes.
That's very Japanese. It takes place both in Kyoto and Tokyo, and as a Japanese friend who I wrote about, a kimono master once said, Kyoto is the home of the yuzen kimono, but also of kachinko. So the Japanese themselves are, more than we are, attuned to this clash of cultures. And it's also a film very much, and this was part of Sydney's oeuvre too, it's a film about masculinity. It's a film about the romance of masculinity. It's a film about the tragedy of it. It sort of anticipates the toxicity that we're now sort of aware of for the first time. But it's not. Some of Sydney's work is romantic, and this has an edge of romance, but it doesn't surrender to it.
The film was written by Paul Schrader, who at the time was completely unknown. He was a film historian, film critic, and the script was sold for $300,000, which is huge even now. But then it was rewritten by Robert Towne. And it's interesting because the original director attached to the script was Scorsese, or at least Scorsese wanted to direct this film.
Right.
But his previous film, which was, I think, Mean Street, was not a success. Then they hired Sidney Pollack. It's also, there is another interesting thing in the cast, because the original actor was Lee Marvin, as you know, who was a bigger star than Mitchum at the time. And they didn't get along, Mitchum and Pollack. And my feeling, I don't know if I'm wrong, it's for political reason. Pollack and even Aldrich, who was the second director after Scorsese, were left-wing, while Mitchum was Republican, far-wing, far-right.
Well, the tension is there in the character also, and he's a loner. This and the Vagabond have in common these loner, detached, loner, familyless protagonists. Sidney married a general's daughter, and when he was introduced to his future father-in-law, he asked him what he should call him, and the man said, "General." So yeah, he was a tough Jewish kid from urban Jewish kid.
I don't know how many of you know the film, because I don't want to spoil the end. Only one? Okay, 2, 3. Okay, before that final, very famous moment, where somehow Robert Mitchum, pays homage to the Japanese culture and pays for what he did. He doesn't respect the code of honor of the Japanese culture, in particular the criminal code. For example, in all the fights, the Japanese actor Ken Takatura, if I pronounce it well, used the katana, while of course Mitchum with rifle and guns and shoots like a cowboy. But then at the end, he understands through that gesture, which I will not mention, that he is in Japan. He has to use their language and their code.
And Schrader has wrote a wonderful essay about the Yakuza, and he makes the point that rigid genre film, this is a genre film, it's a noir, it's a gangster film, they arise at moments of cultural dissolution, of cultural anxiety and change, the way the Western arose at the beginning of the 20th century in America, with a notion of something precious of your past, perhaps fantastical, perhaps not actually based in reality, but a fantastical notion of cultural identity is somehow being eroded, and the Western and the Yakuza film have that in common, and this captures it very much so. It captures that moment in Japan. It's still post-war Japan. It's the 70s.
Let's go to my second choice. The film is Toby Dammit, Tre passi nel delirio. It's based on an Edgar Allan Poe story called Don't Ever Bet Your Head with the Devil. It's Fellini at his bleakest and most desperate. The year was 1967. And the story is about this actor who comes to Rome to play a role in the first Catholic Western. And he doesn't care about the film. He cares only about the Ferrari, which was promised to him, which is a joke because the year before Clint Eastwood came to Rome and they promised him a Ferrari. And he's completely drunk. And in fact, Fellini wanted to hire Peter O'Toole, who wrote a very nasty letter. This is me, how can you insult me, inviting me to do myself? So they replaced him with Terence Stamp. And the makeup is, even in the makeup, it looks like Edgar Allan Poe. And it's a descent into hell. It's the story of an actor who wants to die, and he tries to do it in the most loud and desperate way. And he achieves it. There is a moment right before this scene, which is the Italian Oscars, the most ridiculous and pathetic ceremony ever filmed on the screen, where he's interviewed. And the journalist asks him, do you believe in God? And he says, no. And then he answers, and then she asks, do you believe in the devil? And he says, yes. How desperate is that, you know? And finally, I want to say, I love that scene because Fellini stops the very famous monologue from the Scottish play, which I will not mention, and right before the final line, which is the most desperate, signifying nothing. This is what he feels. Life signifies nothing. Mm-hmm. Do you know this film?
No, revelation.
I recommend you to watch it.
What?
And it's the film that he made after Julius of the Spirits and right before Satyricon. And it's quite unknown. I don't know if anyone from the Criterion collection is here. There is a recurring joke because for 10 years maybe I say you must release Toby Dammit, and then they listen and now you can find easily.
It's funny, the European love for Poe, which Americans love. We study him in this and that, but he's considered the greatest of poets and writers by the French, for example. And T.S. Eliot always liked to say of the French, they don't appreciate the nuances of his vulgarity.
How do you like Poe?
No, I think Poe is in some ways Sidney Pollack's idea of a great source. It's not all great literature, but it makes fantastic movies.
And there are several, of course, adaptations, mostly made by Roger Corman with Vincent Price.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And a year ago, I had Tim Burton as a guest in Rome. And I asked him to select an Italian filmmaker that he liked. And I always ask the same question to all the filmmakers that they come to my festivals. And of course, they always pick Fellini, De Sica, Rossellini, Visconti, the usual suspects. And Barton say, of course, I pick Mario Bava. Okay, it's fine. Why I mention Mario Bava? Because Fellini studied carefully the Bava films for this short story, and in particular in the way he portrays the devil. It's the scariest devil I ever seen on the screen, and it's a little girl. a blonde girl, but believe me, it's very, very scary. Let's go now to your third choice. I love that you picked this film. Judith.
One of the fun. Oh, so this is the film that I saw 56 years ago for the first time. I was 20. I had just gone to Italy, where I lived, where I stayed. I tore up my return ticket. I was staying with a friend's mother in Cortona, the Cortona before Francis Mays, and this film, which had just come out or earlier that year, was screened outdoors in the Teatro Signorelli in Cortona, and my Italian wasn't great. But one of the fantastic things about Brancaleone is you don't really need subtitles. You get it. And when I watched it again for tonight, I could, of course, understand it. And the language is fabulous. It's a sort of crazy mixture of Italian and dialect, and a mixed up faux Latin medieval. So to me it was my love of Italy, going there, my youth, being able to understand an Italian film, watching it outside in this medieval hill town, all of those things. And of course, medieval hill towns feature very prominently in Brancaleone. But going back to and by the way, I was still in Tuscany the next summer, 68, and I watched the moon landing in a little Tuscan farmhouse. So this is, but going back to the theme of toxic masculinity, it sort of seems to be a bee in my bonnet. This is one of the great spoofs. There are elements of Don Quixote, the spoof of the romantic notion of the knight, of course, but it's particularly Italian spoof of machismo. Yeah. And it's 60 years later, it's still one of the funniest things I've ever seen.
I totally agree. I just want to add that it's also a typical Monicelli theme. If you think of I Soliti Ignoti, Big Deal on Madonna Street is another group of outcasts and supposedly good thieves.
Right.
And the cast is fantastic. Vittorio Gassman is the lead. And I'm sure you noticed that the makeup is almost a samurai, which is a very disorienting idea in the Middle Age. And the producer of the film, Mario Cecchigori, was afraid that the language, which is one of the beautiful things of the film, was too difficult, too complicated, and too disorienting. And Monicelli had to insist. And also in terms of casting, Mario Cecchigori had in mind Raimondo Vianello. You might know him. He's a TV star. He used to be a TV star from the role that was played by Gianmaria Volonté. But all the other actors were approved, and they're one better than the other. And the film is not released here. And it's a pity. I don't know. Once again, I must start lobbying with the Criterion Collection. And it was a huge success. And probably in terms of box office is Gassman's most successful film. And it's also a new turn in comedy Italian style, because it's a spoof. It's not about social elements. It's not a parody of the boom of the reconstruction of Italy. And I'm so surprised and happy that you...
No, I was thrilled to see it again. It was hard to get. You managed to get me a copy of it, and to watch it in my on my computer was amazing. But there are two women in the two leads or roles for women in this otherwise pretty much entirely saga of misguided maleness, and both of them are interesting because they've also two characters who refuse the idiotic conventions of romantic, of both medieval and romantic, romantic representation. And one is a maiden who Brancaleone is supposed to deliver to her bridegroom, and the dying father makes him swear he won't deflower her. But one of the bozos deflowers her, unbeknownst to Brancaleone, and she doesn't want to be a virgin. She doesn't know. Thank you very much. And then the other female character is a fabulous takeoff on a Byzantine, voracious, decadent Byzantine noblewoman who also also knows exactly what she wants. So women are given the agency of their desire, let us say, in that sort of academic speak of them.
Can we say that your three choices are all about masculinity?
Yes, in many ways they're about There, the Yakuza is both the sort of romantic tragedy of masculinity. This is a spoof on masculinity. And of course, Vagabond is a critique of everything that's spun out, the web of relationship, of capitalism, of good society, of hierarchy, of obedience, of conformity. So they're all of these films are in some way profoundly about conformity and the prices of going along with it and the prices of not going along with it.
Since you mentioned women, in the previous scene when Terence Stamp delivers the lines from the Scottish play, he mentioned that a woman came to me and invited me. And if you haven't seen the film, the woman that he mentioned is Death herself. There is a woman who is telling him, it's time to go, it's time to reach me, which is also very scary. I always like having games when I have lunch with friends. And one of the games recently was, which one is the best kiss on the screen ever? And in my personal rank, there is a tie between this one, which you will watch in a few minutes, and the kiss between John Cazale and Al Pacino in Godfather Part 2. And I'm asking to my students, do you remember the line of Al Pacino? I know it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart. That's my favorite. Maybe it's the number one, but this is a good second. Let's watch the second kiss. I believe that this film, together with Andrei Rublev, is Tarkovsky masterpiece. And it's incredible because it was a replacement. He was not supposed to shoot this film. It was assigned by Soviet films to another director called Emanuel Abalov, who was fired because he was incompetent. And he replaced him with no budget, basically. The film was not well received in Russia, in the Soviet Union actually, because it was considered to be decadent and too calligraphic. Can you say calligraphic? Yeah. And in other words, not communist enough. But of course, it was immediately well received abroad, and I think now it's a classic. I just want to say something about Tarkovsky, who is one of my favorite filmmakers, especially this period. I recommend you to read Magic Lantern, which is a book by Ingmar Bergman, where there is a moment where he says, who are the greatest directors of all times? And he made a list. And in number one, it's Andrei Tarkovsky. And then he adds, even Antonioni had great talent, but he was suffocated by his own boredom, which is very, very nasty.
Wow, that is really.
But this is what Bergman wrote. So do you know, Ivan, do you know this film?
I don't know it. No,
It's a very tragic story about this young kid who fights against the Nazi during World War II. I don't want to tell you the end, but it's quite sad and bleak. But most of the scenes are on the front. And Tarkovsky is at his best because he really understands the psychology of all his characters, and he loves them. He loves them all. And I think, I could have stopped the scene with the kiss, which is fantastic, but I think it's interesting to see also the follow-up, the way he reacts. I say, now you can go.
Why does he make her go?
Because he's less convinced than she is. And because, men like to make women suffer.
Apparently. This I've been told.
So now I have a little surprise. Judith doesn't know what we're watching. Nobody does. I do. And I like to close the program with something a little bit lighter and funnier. And this film belongs to another category. It's a film where I want to live in. I want to live inside this film. So if you want to know me a little bit more, watch this clip. I don't know if it's more irresistible, De Sica or Sofia in this film. Just very briefly, this is Pane Amore, which is the third installment of the series Pane Amore. The first two were directed by Comencini with Gina Lollobrigida, this one by Dino Risi in color with Sofia. And although the first episode is probably the best This scene is fantastic, I think. Okay, it's time to go, I think.
Thank you, great audience. Thank
you
you,
all.
Antonio.
Thank you, Judith.
What an
Thank
honor
you,
to
Sam.
be here. Thank you.
Our next meeting on April 13 with Mary Karr. We look forward to having you back. Thank you.